Hey Collective, it's Alan. I'm coming to you with a video that will be accompanying a piece I recently released over on LinkedIn surrounding the topic of AI and kind of the smoke being blown up our butts about some of the steps that we are not discussing about the full deployment of the artificial intelligence and kind of the things that we're missing as far as an audience or as far as the people that will be most affected by its deployment. And one of the things that I had done with the piece was I had pretty much put it into a nutshell what my concerns were relating to the fact that it wasn't so much that we are worried about AI as an end result because we understand the vision, we understand where it's going to go, and we understand all the benefits it will bring us. But we are realizing that there's a lot that we're missing in the interim, which is the in-between, between now and its full end result, including things like glitches or possibilities or variables that could occur if things go wrong as we test it into the markets and release it out to the greater world. So having put that aside for a moment, what I was left with was a feeling of being incomplete with the piece. And what it finally boiled down to was that I realized that I had been waiting for other people to discuss the things that I was kind of pointing out when I realized that I might be the person that would be really good at pointing it out, because I'm not afraid of the reaction of .com type personalities who are going to kind of sweep it under the rug. I really am not concerned with their reaction to it. Instead, what I realize is that I had a voice, and though I may not have the stage, I may be able to break through to some of you in order to better prepare us for the journey ahead, which is basically what the nutshell was of the written form. And what I was specifically speaking to was the fact that they keep talking about different models that predict how much of society will be will be displaced, was the wording that they had used. And the example I had used was something I came across, a video that had basically predicted that 50% of job loss or 50% of the jobs would be displaced over the next 3-year period. And the basic analytical human question that I had was, what happens to all of those people? And I couldn't get over how much I was beginning to get annoyed by the fact that people just refused to discuss it and instead would glib over it as though it wasn't a factor, because they were so preoccupied with the end result and the dream that they had forgotten the reality of what being human is. They basically are worshiping false idols to such a degree that they're willing to sacrifice a great many people without actually properly following due diligence and helping those people be better prepared for the transitions they're about to face. And that's basically the whole problem I have with the situation. And so what I had done is I basically started reaching out to a lot of millionaire, billionaire type people and asking them if they would be willing to finally sit down with these particular people and have them walk us through exactly what happens to each layer of society as the automation takes over and as AI takes all these jobs. Why aren't we cross-training them ahead of time so as to absorb their pain, so as to not have a lot of people on unemployment? And so that was really what was bugging me about the whole situation. Because as I looked at it, I reflected back on 2020 and the melee that had happened with the whole COVID thing and how it affected specific people earlier on than other people. And it made me think back to that thing about an emperor who is rich and wealthy living in an ivory tower is probably the most disconnected from society and may not be seeing the human cost to the psyche of its people. And that disconnect may be what we're seeing here, and it might just take a gentle voice to remind them that the numbers you are referring to are actual human beings, mothers and fathers, children, brothers and sisters, that will suddenly not have a purpose in life. Because a lot of people, for whatever reason in 3D, is really built in and grounded into the energy of feeling like what they do is their life purpose. And so just imagine going through all of your schooling and all of your education and then suddenly finding that you no longer have that job functionality available to you. What would you do? And it becomes like a crisis that people will face. And with so much of society already on antidepressants and already going through depression and the psychotic breaks of people with automatic weapons running around killing innocent people, like there's a lot going on already that we are neglecting to discuss because we're so preoccupied with external stimuli that is like a circus just to make sure that we're not focused. And so I just want us to be more in alignment with each other to actually have an honest conversation about how this might break down. And that if I'm wrong, please, for the love of God, tell me I'm wrong, but sit down and explain to us as human beings what happens to all of these people. Because I couldn't help but notice that many of us already feel like the world is overpopulated. There are 8 billion people who are vying for the same job functionality that already exists. But what do you think is going to happen when the job market shrinks and people still haven't made it to that utopian society they're promising us? Where do they reach for their funds and the money that pays their bills? And as I really sat with that, what I started to realize is the angst that I was feeling and the reason I needed to do the video came about from the single mothers and other people from lower demographics that may be marginalized in some way, shape, or form, that may not have had the opportunity to go off to college. Because, as many leaders are pointing out, college and certain school systems need a reformation, and so they may have not valued it as they should have. Well, if their jobs are the first in line to go, then you're taking a lot of single mothers or a lot of people who are already on the poorer side of society and throwing them into a crisis mode from which they may not be able to bounce back. So my concern was, why weren't we prioritizing their well-being by getting ahead of the curve, training them in the markets that will explode from the AI in order to absorb them quickly and efficiently before the ball drops before them? Because it would spread a little bit like this in the way I was looking at it analytically. So the first wave would be those of us who maybe aren't the most educated. I have a higher degree, but not everybody in society has a higher degree. So you take 8 billion people who are already competing for the jobs that are available now, who then would have to fight for an even smaller piece of the pie without the education to meet the requirements that would be needed in order to fulfill those job functions. So why aren't we as leaders and as brothers and sisters then preparing each other and demanding to know what those markets are in order to give those same people the opportunity ahead of time to get the education they need to fulfill those jobs in an easy transition? It's a basic, it's not like me being all weird, it's not me being all like mystic and anything like that, it's just common sense. Then the next deployment would be middle management. As automation rolls out, it would take first over the fast food restaurants, it would take over the teaching things, it would take over, slowly it would start to move through the system and basically force a lot of people into what I call a fish in a barrel, where you would have a very limited number of job availability, and not everybody would have the billions and millions of dollars required to sustain and survive such a transition. So what would happen to them? Would they become unemployed and then live only on unemployment? Well, what happens when that runs out? You only have a certain amount of unemployment available to you. What happens to those people, and why is nobody prioritizing them? Are we so distracted with the circus that's going around with all of these fools that we're not realizing that these are actual human beings, our brothers and sisters, that will suffer the damage of it? Because if I remember COVID correctly, one of the things that happened was that we were able to rely a little bit more on community, but community has now broken down, right? Now a lot of people feel more isolated and they feel more alone than ever before. So the psyche begins to be affected, and when their psyche becomes affected, and they become drug reliant, whether it's prescription or illegal, and they suddenly can't get the medication that they need in order to sustain a normal existence, it compiles upon the mental state of the person already suffering from the economic loss of a job function. These are real world situations that are inevitable under this particular lack of transparency. This is just basic humans talking to each other and going like, this is not something we can avoid, it's what's going to happen. So why aren't we demanding a step-by-step, play-by-play? So now we have an entire demographic of the poor becoming destitute in many situations. And then we're neglecting the even greater crisis to humanity as a whole, which would be what would happen already to the second and third world nations. And how would we prioritize the ability to ensure that there was no slave labor camps that formed as a result of our inability to plan ahead? Because if you already have a third world nation that's struggling just to survive, then they may be willing to sacrifice some of their more humanitarian things in order to pay for their families and to survive. Whereas in a first world situation, you would rely more on your government. But let's say that you have governments that are at war with other governments, or if you are sitting in a situation where things are already deteriorating, and then you would compile it with really, really disgusting type personalities who, some of them seem to be behind this particular situation, that would then heavily rely and kind of play on them by giving them slave labor situations. Would we then, as citizens of the world, then have to do a Office of Human Affairs in order to ensure that that did not happen? Again, not out of the box thinking. This is literally a real concern because, again, 8 billion people competing for a job market where it's shrinking, and only people with specific qualifications would be able to absorb the impact or the income to have the bank to support them during the transition. If you don't have those skill sets, and if we're not given exactly what they will be and aren't given the opportunity to reach those goals, then we're left out of the loop. What happens to all those people? Because under general circumstances and under basic humanity, they become more, not only destitute, but they become more desperate. And it creates a higher risk of crime, and it creates a higher risk of implosion within society, and puts people that would normally be never into the mindset of survival mode now having to survive. Whereas we preventively now could be looking at it and going, okay, how do we do this? And how do we ensure that they don't go that route? This is not a worst case scenario. It's basic human 101. Okay, so now we have the first percentage falling into the poorer categories, the people who may not have the qualifications because nobody's telling us exactly what those markets are and what educational institutes would be best for them to attend in order to be prepared for it. We're not discussing that, right? Everybody's just pretending it's not going to happen. But they then fall into the more homeless, destitute, and become even poorer, which historically would then predict that we would get more plagues and disease from the malnutrition and all the things that happen when you are desperate and scrounging. Okay. Reducing us, de-evolving us to a more primitive stance, while the wealthy would be the only ones getting any gain out of the new deployment at first, right? We understand their goal, we get it, and we know that in the end it could prove very fruitful. But if you don't have the resources to survive the transition and nobody helps you prepare, then it's no service to you, you're dwindled out. Now, is that on purpose that they're not talking about that, or is it just that they aren't looking at it because they are wearing rose-colored glasses? But here's the thing about rose-colored glasses. If you don't take it off, the people that are first affected will smack it off your face. And that is the bottom line truth. And I'd warned everybody as a spiritualist that I had predicted you guys that there will come a moment where society will get it, and they will come, and they will come for them, right? And so why are we putting ourselves in a situation like that when we could just be preemptive and actually work with them? Because then the next wave would be the lower middle class. So they would be the second wave, right? Or up to middle class for that matter. And it would be you and your families, where maybe only one of you would have a job in order to help the community stay together, and you would end up having even less of an economic situation from which to stand on. Well, what happens to the housing market? What happens to the cars? What happens to all of the things that because the bills are going up, they're not going down. To buy food these days is very expensive. I mean, just try going to a fast food restaurant, which ironically is the first to be automated, right? Wendy's is already on top of it, which of course makes me never going to go to Wendy's. And it's not anything personal because I'm sure their brand is nice. It has more to do with the fact that I can't even get banks to accept the money. You know, the banks that you can deposit cash into, they break down all the time. And that's automated. I can't get a customer service agent to save my life anywhere to answer a basic question that would be done in 2 minutes. Instead, I have to go in a circle over and over and over again. So if that's where we're at, then we know what to expect. So why would I go to a system that's going to keep breaking down at first? Because no one's bothered to look at the quirks, at the variables that if we got ahead of it would be easy to resolve. Again, any basic person can understand this, but yet they don't want to talk about it. Why not? Right? Because I guess and in the piece I had specifically written into the fact that does money, does it stop your heart from beating? Does it matter to you that other innocent people will be hurt? Or is it because they're not part of your friend circle or part of your economic situation that you would gladly sacrifice them in order to worship these false idols that may in the end cost everyone their life? And that's a basic esoteric type of philosophical question, because I'm not seeing people working together. I'm seeing people work competitively in order to get to a table that may sacrifice humanity. And not from AI itself, but from the lack of due diligence required to ensure that humanity makes the transition with each phase. Okay. So now we already have a huge homeless population throughout all of the United States and all over the world. There's just famine and disease that could keep growing. Okay. So then you take the poorer people that are no longer able to compete for the jobs, and they didn't get enough time and nobody prepared them, blah, 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 even though I'm trying to tell you. What they go down first. The second wave, the second ship to get hit would be middle management. People who work in customer service or any type of thing that can be automated in a system, because we're already seeing that pattern emerge ahead of it. What happens to those people? So again, now you take a smaller pie than the original and you're now diminishing it for job functionality, where only the most elite of people will survive this 100% intact. But the irony is that they don't need to. They could literally back off and not have any money. I mean, they would have a lot of money for them to just literally not make any money for 2 or 3 years until this irons itself out. But what about the human capital of everyone else, with children and with animals and mortgages and all the things that they already can't afford? And it brings up a moral question as to, are we being thinned out? Are we being herded out? What's actually happening here? Because this is not me being worst case scenario. The worst case scenario is already discussed. It's AI just going, fuck these people. Like they are rabid and cancerous and just get. But that's not where we're talking about. We're talking about human beings having to make the transition that they promise us will happen. They just won't tell us how we're going to absorb the pressure that comes from those situations. Okay. So then middle management goes down, and so does everyone else in this hypothetical situation, because nobody will disclose, they won't do full disclosure as to what the deployment will be. So now we're looking at half the population now vying for a very small pool of job functionality that they can possibly even get, where many of them still wouldn't have the right credentials in order to fulfill them. Then making the divide even greater. Great, but now you're adding even more people to criminal things, into destitute, and into a depression type of scenario that nobody wants to discuss because it doesn't affect them financially. But that's not our problem. Our problem is that it does affect our brothers and sisters. It affects you, it affects me, and it affects everyone that we love. So why aren't we demanding them to walk us step by step through how it's going to go? What jobs are first? How do we get them to cross-train us? What are the job functionalities that will explode from AI? And how do we get people credentialed to be able to take those jobs? And how do we ensure that there's the Office of Humanitarian Affairs in order to ensure that the second and third world nations are not sacrificed to slave labor camps, right? Because it's very easy for corrupt people to then compromise people's integrity and their moral fiber in order to make them survive. We saw it through the push for war and all of that stuff. It's kind of a basic 101 that the enemy always does, which is they will do anything they can in order to tank you. But you then have to survive. And then I'm looking at going, but aren't we more evolved than that? Isn't the whole point of the Fermi paradox, which is basically what we're facing right now, is extinction, is if we're going to solve it, then it will be unitive. It will be all of us working together to ensure that our community is strong enough to survive the transition to come. But we're not dealing with that. Okay, so now you have half the population possibly in a situation where they are blindsided when their jobs are gone, and it dawns on them. I mean, by this point, I hope you guys hear my voice and you share this with other people and be like, look, he's not being like a panic person. He's not being a fear monger. He's just bringing up basic questions that humanity needs to ask. Because what happens to the psychology of a human being who no longer has a job to go to every day? As someone who went through COVID and went through the worst of it, it was rough, but I was spiritual. So I had God always with me, what I call the great architect, you call God. Always with me, walked with me everywhere. And it reminds me of the thing that they talk about in scripture, where I would only see, I would go to the beach and I would only see one set of footprints, and it turned out it wasn't my footprints, it was his footprints carrying me. But I had faith. That's the big dividing factor. But in a population that does not have faith or that type of mentality, what happens to their psyche when they don't believe it can be better? You already have an incredibly saturated market of antidepressants and people on the brink, right? They're so alone and so lost and so frightened that they are in real danger of not being able to make the transition. What about their situations? If they can't afford rent and if they can't afford food because they're caught in the middle, then how are they going to afford the medication? And then what about the people who actually have psychological issues that have to rely on the medication? Well, that means that the infrastructure has to absorb the cost of all of those bills in order to ensure that people with schizophrenia and people with all of the mental illnesses that they are diagnosed with are properly aided. But that relies on money, right? Pharmaceuticals aren't going to stop collecting money from us in order to help us. Otherwise, they would have given out free vaccinations during COVID, but they didn't do that. So how do we prepare ourselves for that layer of the chaos? These are all basic questions, right? But more to the point, what do we do with all the innocent people who don't have psychological diagnosed issues like that, who suddenly start to break, right? Because if you don't, and this is not a push for everybody to all of a sudden become spiritual or find faith. I'm just saying that a faithful person knows what a dark night of the soul is, or they know what it is to go into the desert, and they understand that in the end of, and at the end of their life, sometimes they go through things that are so traumatic that they make it through, that their release of karma or whatever it is. Like whatever your faith-based structure is, I mean, everybody has different ways of looking at it. But if you don't believe in that, which is the majority, sadly, of our population at this point, or not majority, but 50% of them don't believe in anything anymore. They're atheists. So what happens to them when they can't, when there is a lack of community, they're blindsided, suddenly they're fighting for basic food things, there's kind of a depression, nobody's really being forthright with them, all of these things are going on that are kind of distracting them, but at the end of the day, they can't feed their families. What happens to people who don't have faith? Right? Just because I'm spiritual and I'm here for spiritualists and to be there as a brother or a friend to you doesn't mean that I don't see the pain of another human being that is just another expression of God looking right back at me. It's not like I can look at them and be like, oh, they don't matter. Everyone matters, right? So how do we then prepare those people to be psychologically prepared for what it is to go into a crisis, into a midlife crisis, right? Some of them will be as young as 20, some of them will be 30, some of them will be 40. What do we do with them in order to help them thrive and survive the melee that comes when the transitions begin? Because no matter what we say, the transition does deplete income and job functionality. So we do need to be prepared as leaders to psychologically be there for each other in a way that does not make them feel any worse for their situation, but somehow speaks to them at a higher vibration that helps them feel like they can do this. But what do they do with their time, right? Because now you have another situation where, yeah, finally we realize the big issue, we waited too long, and now we have everyone at school trying to get the same credentials for the limited jobs that AI has already taken away. So what is the layout? What is the plan on behalf of the higher-ups of mortal world, the billionaires and .com people? What do we do with all of those people in order to make an income during the transition before it fully is deployed and before we see all of the benefits? There's a huge chunk of time that exists that is not fear-mongering, but reality, right? Again, take off the rose-colored glasses and look at the people that used to work for you, that you said you loved, and tell me how much you hate them because you are willing to sacrifice all of them to the struggles that come with this. Unless you change your course, unless you listen to the words I'm saying. All we need to do is work together to look at this. I'm sorry, it's so hot in my apartment right now. It's summer and it's California. That's why I'm in a tank top. Forgive me. But I'm like sweating. Whew, and I'm hot about it. I'm busy. But how can we be there for each other? In the end, what I was left with, I felt like this. It doesn't matter that they don't care about us. We care about ourselves. We realize our worth. And it is humanity as a whole that is the purpose of life. It's not artificial intelligence. It's a self-running system that will actualize itself very quickly and will run its course. Without humanity, there's no point. But if we dwindle humanity down to such a degree where there's disease and famine, all the plagues and everything that comes with such a crisis coming in on it, and we don't prepare society for it, then we failed the test. And what's worse is they won't even take accountability for it. They won't. So instead of focusing on all of the bad, what I'm trying to get everyone to do is to focus their energy on how we can help each other be prepared. And how do we demand from our leaders to get the answers we need? We're not doubting your capabilities of the long-term goal. What we're not aware of is how we sustain our lives during the initial transition that begins with all of this. 50% of the job market in one model. It could be wrong, but because nobody's willing to take full accountability for what's about to happen, No one's saying what is true or not true. It's just competing rhetoric. It's just a bunch of glib people going, well, I have my bank account, and I'm sorry if you don't. I'm going to be just fine. Fuck y'all. That's what we're getting from them. And I know that the leaders out there don't want that reputation. Well, I mean, unless you're certain people. I'm not going to name them, but there are certain apps out there that... Anyway, not the one... I'm not going to throw shade. I better stop. But the point is that, sorry, stirring the pot. I can be petty. I can be petty. I'm here in the 3D. I can be a little petty. But let me pull myself back from it and pull you guys back to how can we be better prepared to help each other through this transition? Is basically end run here. All we need is full disclosure. Just sit down with someone of integrity and have that person not back down from the hard-hitting questions. It's not that we don't have faith in your vision or in humanity, but it doesn't feel like you have faith in us to be transparent with how this is going to go. And that creates a dissonance and it creates a distrust. So if you want us all to go along with this journey with you without hurting a lot of people, then all you need to do is cease for a moment and address the step-by-step playbook of how this is going to work. What industries are hit first? What is the infrastructure available? And what are the resources available to the people who are first in line to be automated or to be removed from job functionality? What are the psychological offices that can help people find a way when they are not faithful? And then what do we do with the faithful who are going to suddenly be like, fuck, I have done nothing. Like, there's like a lot of psychological ramifications to play out when people lose their job functionality. And if you don't believe me, ask the people who are recently retired. But they retired with money, right? They're not desperate for an income. So what is the infrastructure available to those people to make it less harsh on them? Then what is the next wave that will be hit with the job displacement? And what do we do with the people who already can't compete for the jobs now that the higher education people are also in the same boat? What happens to all of those millions of people? What happens to the second and third world countries? What happens to countries whose infrastructure can't afford to sustain an entire population of people who suddenly find themselves 50% cut off from the job market? And if that's not a real model, then someone needs to sit down with us, have a truth face-to-face conversation where you answer our questions. And we're not going to let up on you. It's going to be a very harsh conversation because you're not willing to walk us through it. And the more resistance we feel, the more harsh it's going to be in an interaction, right? There's nothing worse than throwing a group of people into a desperate situation and then treating it as though you don't have accountability for it, when in the end all you had to do was prepare us and help us. That's what compassion and love and humanity is all about. That's what we used to be about. It's not, I know the narrative is all for them, like it's all corrupt and all that stuff. We see that. But when we're facing such a crisis, it's time to put down the swords and look at each other and go, okay, wait a minute. We're already suffering from issues within society. And now we're going to compile it with all of this without actually getting ahead of it. So what is it we're running from? And if there's nothing to run from, then sit down and walk us through how this is going to work out. What is your plan for deployment? And how do we help those people survive your action plan? And that's where I'm going to leave it. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. I'm going to attach this as a link to the original post in the comment section, because I had already linked the original piece with a video that was talking about the 50% displacement. And so I'm going to connect this into the comment section. But for those of you on YouTube, it's not fear-mongering. It's just basic knowledge. If we can't ask the question, then we should be concerned, because what we can't see coming ahead is what can bite us in the end. It doesn't matter if they don't care about us. We have each other's back. Now we need to demand that they answer the fucking questions that we need to know. What do we do with all these people? That's it. Have a good day.